My blood pressure was 154/90. The morning everything changed. I know that number because the nurse read it out loud twice, like saying it again would make it make more sense. She wrapped the cuff around my arm a second time, pumped it up slowly, and when the result came back the same, she made a note in the file and told me the doctor would want to talk about it. I nodded like I wasn't already aware that my body had been quietly screaming at me for months. I was 31, I ate okay, I didn't smoke. There was no reason for it except for the one reason I wasn't ready to say out loud yet, which was that I had been swallowing stress the way some people swallow pills, constantly, mechanically, without thinking about what it was doing to me on the inside. The clinic was one of those generic places that smells like antiseptic and filtered air. Generic chairs, generic posters about hand washing and flu vaccines. I picked it specifically because it wasn't my usual doctor. My usual doctor knew my mother. And I decided a year earlier that I needed a place where I could be honest without worrying about what got back to anyone. I still hadn't been honest. I'd just been paying copays somewhere new while lying to a different stranger in a white coat. That day, the doctor who walked in wasn't who I'd seen before. I remember noticing that immediately, not in a dramatic way. Just someone different walked through the door and I looked up from my phone and processed that this wasn't Dr. Reyes who usually saw me. This was someone younger. He had a paper chart under one arm and he was flipping through it without looking up yet. And for a second I had that specific hospital anxiety where you wonder if something's wrong, if there's been a scheduling error, if you're about to be given news meant for someone else. He said Malik and looked up. I said yeah. He introduced himself, Dr. Idris Osai Mensa, said he was covering for Dr. Reyes who'd been pulled into a procedure. He sat down across from me on the little rolling stool that every exam room has, set my chart on the counter and said, "So your blood pressure is elevated, has this come up before?" I told him no, not on paper anyway. He asked what I meant. And something about the way he asked it, not pushy, not clinical, just kind of curious and patient, made me say more than I intended. I told him I meant I'd been stressed, that it had been a long year, that I wasn't sleeping great. He nodded and wrote something down. Then he asked, "Is there anything specific driving the stress or is it more general?" I almost said something vague. I had the vague answer ready. Something about work, about apartment stuff, the usual list of deflections. But I looked at him for a second, actually looked at him, which I don't always do with doctors because eye contact in medical settings makes me feel weirdly exposed, and something stopped me from saying the usual thing. I said, "It's personal stuff." He said, "Okay." Just that, "okay," not "you can tell me" or "I'm here to help" or any of the phrases that make you feel like you're being coached into a confession. Just a neutral, unhurried "okay," and he kept writing, and that was somehow the most disarming thing anyone had said to me in months. I said, "I'm kind of in the middle of figuring something out about myself." He set the pen down, not in an alarmed way, more like he was making space. "Take your time," he said. I didn't tell him everything that day. I told him I'd been dealing with some stuff about my identity and that I didn't have a lot of people I could talk to about it. I didn't use words like gay or queer. I wasn't ready. But I said enough that he understood the shape of it and he didn't flinch and he didn't pivot immediately back to the blood pressure numbers. He said, "That kind of internal pressure, the kind you can't talk to anyone about, it's not nothing. It sits in the body. Your numbers make more sense to me now." I don't know why that made my eyes sting. Maybe because he said, "Your numbers make sense," like there was a version of me that made sense, like I wasn't just a malfunction. He gave me a 3-month plan. Lower sodium, try walking, and he recommended a therapist, a good one, he said, who specialized in identity stuff and had a lot of LGBTQ patients. He wrote the name on a slip of paper instead of printing it out, which felt more personal somehow, like it wasn't just protocol. I took it, I folded it, I put it in my jacket pocket and didn't look at it again for 2 weeks. What I did do the day after that appointment was look him up. Not like that, or maybe a little like that, but mostly I was just trying to confirm he was a real person who actually worked there because the whole interaction had felt slightly unreal. He had a profile on the clinic's website, brief bio, medical school, residency, areas of focus. He had a kind of serious expression in the photo that didn't quite match how he'd been in person, where he'd seemed more relaxed, more open than professional headshots usually let people look. I went back to the clinic 3 weeks later, not for a scheduled appointment. I told myself I was going because I'd had a headache that wouldn't quit for 4 days and I should get it checked out, which was true, but I'd also deliberately booked with Dr. Osai Mensa. His assistant noted that I'd requested him specifically. I said he'd seen me recently and I just wanted continuity of care, which was a thing you could say. People said that. He came in and checked my chart and looked up and said, "Your pressure's better already, down to 138. I said, "Yeah, I'd been walking." He said, "Every day." I said, "Most days." He said, "That's not nothing either." And then he checked the headache, asked me questions about it, had me follow his finger with my eyes pressed carefully along my neck and jaw. His hands were careful and professional and nothing about it was inappropriate. But I was hyper-aware in a way that I hadn't been in a medical setting before and I didn't fully know what to do with that. He said it was probably tension, recommended magnesium, hydration and sleep, and said if it didn't resolve in a week to come back. Right before he left, he paused at the door and said, "Did you reach out to that therapist?" I said, "Not yet." He said, "No pressure, but you might feel better than you think you will once you do." I said, "Okay." He said, "See you in 3 months." He left. I sat on the paper-covered exam table for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the crinkle of it, and thought about the fact that I had just deliberately arranged to see this man again, which was something I had never done before in my life about anyone. That was the beginning of me taking myself seriously. I called the therapist that week. Her name was Renata. She had a calm office with plants in every corner and a white noise machine outside the door. In our second session, I said the word gay out loud for the first time in a formal, intentional way, not as a flinch or a joke or a deflection, but as a fact about myself that I was finally handing to someone to hold while I figured out what to do with it. Renata didn't react like it was a big deal. She said, "How does it feel to say it?" I said terrifying and also like I'd put something down that I'd been carrying for a very long time. She said both of those can be true. I thought about that for the rest of the day. 3 months passed, I went back to the clinic. My blood pressure was 124/80. Dr. Osai Mensa looked at the number and actually smiled, not a professional satisfaction smile, a real one. He said, "Look at that." I said, "Therapy's helping." He said, "I can tell." Something in the air was different from the appointment. I don't know how to explain it except that he seemed more like a person to me than a doctor, and I think that was partly because I had become more like a person to myself over those 3 months. When you stop hiding from yourself, you stop disappearing in other rooms too. At the end of the appointment, as he was wrapping up, I said, and I don't fully know why I said this except that I was done not saying things, "Can I ask you something that might be a little weird?" He looked up, said, "Sure." I said, "Do you ever feel like you have to take care of everyone around you and you're not sure who takes care of you?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that means someone is actually thinking, not just computing an answer. He said, "Yeah, I feel that pretty often actually." I said, "I thought maybe you did." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because you're very good at making space for other people's stuff and I wasn't sure if anyone ever made space for yours." There was a silence that felt very long and also very short. He looked at me with an expression that I couldn't fully read, something between surprised and careful and something else I didn't have a name for yet. He said, "That's a thoughtful thing to notice." I said, "I've had a lot of time to learn how to notice things about people who aren't me." He smiled at that, said, "Me too." I said goodbye and walked out and spent the entire bus ride home staring out the window wondering what exactly I was doing. Whether I was reading something that wasn't there, whether I was projecting, whether the past few months of becoming more honest with myself had somehow made me bold in ways I hadn't calculated. I told Renata about it at my next session. She said, "What do you think it meant?" I said I didn't know. She said, "What did it feel like?" I said it felt like talking to someone who actually heard me, like the words I was saying were landing somewhere instead of just dissipating. She said, "And is that unusual for you?" I thought about it. I said, "Yeah, pretty unusual." She said, "So maybe that's worth paying attention to." 4 months later, and this is the part of the story I have told and retold in my head because I still can't believe it happened the way it happened, I ran into him outside the clinic. Not inside, outside. I had just picked up a prescription and he was coming back from what I assume was a lunch break, still in his coat, carrying a coffee cup, and we almost literally walked into each other on the sidewalk. He said, "Malik." I said, "Hey." We both stood there for a second. That specific social pause that happens when you know someone in one context and you're suddenly outside that context without the usual scaffolding. I said, this is the most disorienting thing that's happened to me this week. He laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, the kind that people don't do when they're still being professional. He said, I was just thinking the same thing. I said, how are you? He said, tired but okay, long morning, how are you? I said, better, genuinely, I don't say that to many people. He said, I know, I read it in your chart numbers. I laughed at that. He looked at me for a second, then he said, can I ask you something that might be a little weird? I said sure because he'd borrowed my line and I wasn't about to miss the irony. He said, do you want to get coffee sometime? Not here, not as a patient thing, just like people. I stood there. He said, I know there's an ethical question there and I've thought about it, and technically if you transfer care to another physician before he stopped himself, took a breath, said, sorry, that came out very medical. What I mean is I've thought about this and I don't want to make it weird, but I also, another pause. You're the only person who has ever asked me who takes care of me, and I've been thinking about that for 4 months. Something in my chest did something complicated. I said, I've been thinking about it too. He said, yeah. I said, yeah. He said, so. I said, so. We were both smiling and it was awkward in the best way, the way things are awkward when something is real and neither person has a script for it. I said, I'll transfer my care, call it a fresh start. He said, that works. I said, then yes, coffee as people. He said, good. His phone buzzed, he looked at it and made a face. He said, I have to go back in, but can I get your number? Which is also weird because I technically have it in your file, but it would feel wrong to use it like that. I said here, and typed it into his phone manually, the way you do when you want it to mean something. He said, I'll text you tonight. He did. At 9:47 p.m., he said, this is Idris, I hope that's okay. I thought about not texting until tomorrow to seem less eager, but then I decided I'm too old for that. I stared at that message for a full minute. I typed back, I was literally just thinking about checking if you'd text. He said, well, here I am. I said, here you are. We texted for 2 hours that night, not about anything important, about his commute, about a documentary I'd been watching, about the fact that he'd been a biology nerd since he was 8 years old and had always known he'd be a doctor, about how I'd studied finance but pivoted to urban planning and somehow never regretted it. We talked the way people do when they're discovering that they want to keep talking, when each thing the other person says opens up a new door and you keep walking through. At some point I said, I have to sleep, early morning. He said, yeah, same, this was good though. I said, yeah, it was. He said, good night, Malik. I said, good night, Idris. And even just his name felt different when I typed it. Not Dr. Osai Mensa, Idris, a person, my peers, someone who'd asked me for my number on a sidewalk and then texted me because he was too tired to pretend he wasn't eager. Our first coffee was on a Saturday. He was already there when I arrived, which I liked immediately. He'd gotten there early. He had a book open on the table, but he wasn't reading it, just kind of sitting with it. And when I walked in, he looked up and something shifted in his face, that micro-expression of relief people have when someone they were hopping would show up actually shows up. We stayed for 3 hours. The coffee got cold. The cafe filled up and emptied and filled up again, and we barely noticed. We talked about things I don't usually talk about in early conversations, his family's expectations when he came out in his mid-20s, my own years of detour and avoidance, and the particular exhaustion of performing straightness when you're surrounded by people who assume it. We talked about loneliness in specific, detailed ways, the kind of conversation where you realize partway through that you're not lonely right now, not in this moment, and that contrast is its own kind of ache. He said at one point, I think I've been careful for so long that I forgot what it felt like to just say things. I said, I know exactly what you mean. He said, is that strange that we can do this already? It feels like we skipped several steps. I said, I think the checkups were the steps. He smiled, said, yeah, I guess they were. I want to tell you that everything was smooth after that we glided into something easy and uncomplicated, but we didn't, and I think that's part of why it lasted. The first time we argued was about 2 months in. I had started pulling back not because of anything he did, but because I was scared in the specific way that happens when something feels real and your entire history says that real things get taken away. I became quieter. I answered his texts with less. I canceled on him once and then again and gave reasons that were technically true but not the actual reason. He noticed. He said over the phone, I feel like I'm doing something wrong and I don't know what it is. I said he wasn't doing anything wrong. He said, Malik, I know what people sound like when they're retreating. I've watched patients do it when they're scared of a diagnosis. I'm not going to pretend I don't recognize it. I was quiet. He said, you don't have to explain it right now, but I just want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. So if you're waiting for me to decide this is too complicated and leave, I'm not going to do that. I said, how do you know? He said, because I know what I want. I figured that out a long time ago, I'm just patient. I sat with that for 3 days. Then I called him and I told him the truth, not a summarized version of it. The full thing, the years of pretending, the exhaustion of it, the specific anxiety I had about happiness being a setup, about something good only being the calm before I lost it. It took almost an hour. I cried, which I hadn't done in front of anyone for years. He didn't try to fix it. He just stayed on the line and said, yeah, in the particular way people do when they want you to know they're listening without interrupting you. At the end, he said, thank you for telling me. I said I wasn't sure I was going to. He said, I know, I'm glad you did. That was the moment I stopped waiting for him to disappoint me and started actually being there with him. There's a night I think about more than any other night from that first year. We'd gone to see a late movie, something one of his colleagues had recommended that turned out to be more emotionally brutal than either of us expected. We walked out of the theater into the cold and stood on the sidewalk for a second, both of us still processing. He said I was not prepared for that. I said neither was I. He put his arm around me, not dramatically, just put his arm around me the way you do when you're cold and the person next to you is warm and it makes sense. And we walked like that for a block, 2 blocks, just walking, not talking much, and it was the most specific feeling of peace I had experienced in years, maybe ever. The sense that someone was next to me and I didn't have to explain myself or perform or be okay in any particular way. I said quietly, is this weird for you, being out here like this? He said, what do you mean? I said, in public, with me. He said, no, is it weird for you? I thought about it honestly. I said, I'm still learning to let it not be weird. He said, me too sometimes, but I like learning it with you. We found a diner that was still open and ate eggs at midnight and talked until the waitress started obviously hovering near our table wanting to flip it. He laughed when I noticed and waved at her apologetically, and we paid and left a big tip and went out into the cold again. Standing outside waiting for our cabs to come separately, he said, I have a confession. I said, what? He said, that day in the clinic, your first appointment, when you said it's personal stuff and you had that look on your face, I thought about you after. Not in a, I know how this sounds, but it wasn't inappropriate. I just thought about you, whether you were okay. I think about a lot of my patients, but it was different. I couldn't figure out why. I said, and now? He said, now I think I recognize something that maybe I hadn't seen in a while. I said, what? He said, someone trying to be honest with themselves, someone in the middle of becoming something. I said, that's a generous way to describe someone with high blood pressure. He laughed, his cab pulled up, he looked at me. He said, you're pretty good, Malik, in case no one's told you lately. I said, you're not bad yourself, Dr. Osai Mensa. He rolled his eyes at the name, got in the cab and waved through the window. I stood there until the cab was gone. I called my sister the next morning. My sister is one of 2 people in my family who knew about me at that point, and she'd known about me for about 6 months because she'd caught me crying in my car at Christmas and I'd told her everything. She'd cried too, then she'd called me an idiot for not telling her sooner and hugged me for a long time. I called her and said, I think I'm in something real. She said, the doctor. I said, how did you know it was him? She said, Malik, you've mentioned him in every single conversation we've had for 4 months. I said, I have. She said, yes, Idris says this. Idris thinks that. Idris laughed when I told him about Aunt Cecile. You talk about him constantly and I don't think you know you're doing it. I sat with that. She said, is he good to you? I said, yeah, he's really good to me. She said, then stop waiting for it to fall apart and be in it. That's the thing about people who have known you your whole life. They say in one sentence what takes you months to work up to alone. I told Idris what she said, eventually. Not right away. But one evening when we were at his apartment, the 2 of us were making dinner. him chopping vegetables badly and me pretending not to notice and then finally taking the knife from him because I couldn't watch anymore. I told him what she'd said. About how I'd been mentioning him in every conversation without realizing it. He stopped to look at me. He said, "Can I tell you something embarrassing?" I said, "Sure." He said, "My friend Quame asked me in February why I kept bringing up this guy from the clinic. I said I didn't know what he was talking about. He literally read back 3 separate conversations where I'd mentioned you." I put down the knife. I said, "February was before we even got coffee." He said, "I know." I said, "So you were already?" He said, "Yeah." We looked at each other. He said, "Is that strange?" I said, "No, it's the least strange thing you've ever told me." He crossed the kitchen and kissed me. Not for the first time. We'd had those first times already weeks earlier with all the nervousness and small awkwardness those moments carry. But this one was different, quieter, less nervous and more like something landing, like two people who had been circling something finally just standing still inside it. I've thought a lot about what made this different from every other time I'd tried to be with someone, the attempts that didn't work, the relationships I half lived in because I was still half hiding. The difference wasn't him specifically, though he's extraordinary. The difference was that I met him in the middle of the process of becoming honest about myself. He didn't get the version of me that was managing a performance. He got the version that was learning to take up space. He says I did the same for him, that my question, "Do you know who takes care of you?" was something no one had asked him directly. That he'd built a life out of being capable and useful, and he'd let himself believe that was the same as being okay. That I made him look at that and find it wasn't. We take care of each other now. Clumsily sometimes. We argue about small things and occasionally about big things, and neither of us is always right. He still has a tendency to internalize until it pressurizes. I still have a tendency to retreat when things feel too good. We know each other's patterns now, and knowing them doesn't make us immune to them, but it means we can name them when they're happening, and that numbing is usually enough to keep things from calcifying into something unresolvable. His mother met me at a family dinner about 8 months in. She shook my hand and then looked at him with an expression I can only describe as cautious hope. Like she'd been waiting for him to bring someone home who seemed like the real thing and wasn't sure if that was what this was yet. By the end of dinner, she was asking me about urban planning. She'd worked in city government for years. We talked about infrastructure funding for 45 minutes while Idris sat next to me looking like he didn't know whether to laugh or feel emotional. Afterward in the car he said, "She loves you." I said I liked her. He said, "She told me on my way out that you have good energy," which from her is basically a formal endorsement. I said I'll put it on my resume. He laughed, then went quiet for a second, then said, "Thank you for tonight, for showing up like that, for being yourself." I said I'm still practicing. He said, "You're better at it than you think." I don't know where we'll be in 5 years. I used to say things like that as a way of hedging, of not getting too attached to an outcome, but I'm learning to say it now as something more neutral. As just an honest acknowledgement that the future is unwritten, and that's not a threat, it's just the nature of things. What I know right now, my blood pressure is 118/76. I checked it last month on one of those machines at the pharmacy. I took a photo of the reading and sent it to Idris, and he sent back a voice note of himself doing a ridiculous celebration sound. I know that I am more myself at 32 than I was at 22 or 27 or even 31 when I walked into a generic clinic with a tight chest and said it's personal stuff and couldn't say more. I know that becoming honest about yourself is not a one-time event. It's a practice. You do it in small moments, the moment you say the word out loud to a stranger, the moment you call a therapist, the moment you transfer your medical care to a different physician and text someone your number on purpose, the moment you stop waiting for something good to be taken away and just live inside it. I know that some people come into your life as catalysts, not in a magical way, but in the specific quiet way of someone who asks the right question at the right time and then doesn't look away when you try to answer it. I know that I almost didn't go to that appointment. My calendar had it twice rescheduled. I almost canceled it a third time. I had 100 small excuses. I was busy. I felt fine mostly. I'd go next month. I didn't cancel. And the doctor was shocked. He told me once, not by the blood pressure numbers, not by any test result, but by the fact that when he'd asked a simple throwaway question about stress, I'd given him a real answer instead of a safe one. He said most people don't. He said he'd been asking that question for years and people usually said work stuff or family stuff and moved on. He said something about the way I'd paused and then told a real truth had stuck with him in a way he couldn't explain at the time. I told him I almost didn't say it. He said, "I'm glad you did." I said, "Me too." There's a specific kind of miracle in the ordinary moments that turn out to be turning points. You never know, walking into them, that they're the ones: the appointment that gets rescheduled twice, the doctor who covers a shift he wasn't supposed to cover, the question asked without expecting a real answer, the answer given for once without a performance attached. My blood pressure was 154/90. The morning everything changed. Now it isn't. And neither am I.